Hi again, listeners, and welcome to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
So, Alex, thanks to either luck or your careful planning, this is the first in a two-part Fantasy Animation Christmas special on C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, which we're going to be looking at in terms of a kind of a handful or a cross-section of different kinds of adaptations that I think in different ways traverse the sort of fantasy and animation intersection. So, teaser, we will be looking at the 2005 adaptation of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, so the high fantasy Hollywood feature in a future episode. Further teaser, we've already recorded it, so there we go. As you said, Alex, before we started, that's very Narnia of us. But today we're looking at two other adaptations. So the 1979 animated film Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe, directed by Bill Melendez of Peanuts, Snoopy and Woodstock fame, and the BBC series of the same name, Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, from about a decade later, 1988, both of which, unsurprisingly, I was unfamiliar with. So I have notes on voice work, on beavers, on Santa, and also on queerness in the case of the witch. So maybe we could kind of scratch that as well. Alex, this is very much, I feel this is, you couldn't look happier.
I'm having a lovely time already, Chris. Yes. Now, two versions that unsurprisingly I'm quite familiar with.
Yeah.
Particularly penchant for the BBC adaptation. I remember watching that. Probably eating the same thing that Lucy and Mr. Tumnus are eating, like on a Sunday evening, watching it when it was first broadcast. So yes, I'm excited to visit with that. Of course, we're going to claim this as a Christmas movie.
Yep.
Listeners will have to see previous footnotes as to how we define Christmas movies. But there's snow. It's on at that time of the year. It's fantasy. We've even got Father Christmas in it, so that's not a problem. But I'm excited to hear from our conversation, but particularly from our guest, more about the kind of the story, its creation, its creator, C.S. Lewis, because I remember as a PhD student reading his theories of fantasy and finding them really kind of interesting and a kind of odd but fascinating kind of bedfellow with the Tolkien stuff we've done.
Oh yeah,
I've got to be honest, I've not revisited it since. I need a refresher course, and we've got we've got the master at refreshing it, I think, for us. So that's great.
Absolutely. So we are absolutely delighted, as you say, to be joined by Terry Lindvall, who is the C.S. Lewis Endowed Chair in Communication and Christian Thought and Professor of Communication at Virginia Wesleyan College. He is a C.S. Lewis scholar and expert, as well as an expert in American film and media, seeking to kind of engage with the intersection between theological thought, Christian faith and tradition, and the cinema. He's also served as a U.S. Army Reserve chaplain and has taught at a number of colleges too. He is, we were joking before we started, he's the author of numerous publications, which I won't have time to read because that will take us to the full hour. However, just to flag, his first book, Surprised by Laughter, The Comic World of C.S. Lewis, from 1996, Sanctuary Cinema, Origins of the Christian Film Industry from 2007, right up to other books that look at biblical narratives and comedy, a book called God Mocks, A History of Religious Satire from the Hebrew Prophets to Stephen Colbert, and then recently, although not most recently, given what we've already mentioned before we started, he has a recent book, Animated Parables, A Pedagogy of Seven Deadly Sins and a Few Virtues from 2022. So this is a book that examines how short animated films teach us, directly and indirectly, about vice and virtue, and connects together a range of global cartoons to explore the animator's role in displaying the seven deadly sins. He's also teased us before we started about a new project on Pixar, so we look more forward to hearing more about that. Amid all of that, he's also found time to contribute to the Fantasy Animation website. So, goodness me, Terry, thank you ever so much for joining us on the podcast.
Chris and Alex, good to be with you all.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really great to have you, and you're one of those guests I think we've been sort of itching to sort of we have a list of people that we think this would be a really good person to kind of chat with. So we're delighted to kind of finally get you on and to sort of in this case put a face to the name. So what, Terry, attracted you to Lewis as somebody who's sort of I think has clearly guided your career in lots and lots of different ways?
Well, I was in college in the 1960s, late 1960s, and two things began to kind of really make an impact on me. One was reading Screwtape Letters, all about the devils, and Lewis's sense of humor just really kind of caught me. But at the same time, I started kind of watching early 70s Gene March on public television, who did this program on international animation. And I started seeing these short films, and they captured my imagination much as anything else. Now, Lewis, like you two, I mean, when he went to Oxford University College there, he got a first in philosophy, a first in classics, a first in literature. You all probably got first in everything as well, too. But he just basically brought together, and he was an atheist throughout his basically his college years. And there were kind of traditional 19th century fantasy writers who really influenced him and just channeled his thoughts while he was an atheist. And one of the key people was George MacDonald. And I don't know if you've done George MacDonald yet, but Lewis was going on a train station, going somewhere, and he found this little book called Fantastes. And he picked it up by George MacDonald. And Fantastes is really one of those kind of monumental moments that woke him up to the power of fantasy and the power that there is something marvelous and uncanny in the world. As a thoroughgoing materialist and a Freudian, he didn't really want to accept anything like that, but it just disturbed him so much. And so all of a sudden, fantasy became kind of something in the twilight, in the evenings. He realized it's going to shape him who he was. And it really would come to fruition later on when he'd meet Tolkien, when they were both teaching in Oxford. And Tolkien would take him into Christianity. But it was this kind of romanticism from Germany that really began to kind of open things up for him.
He's a really interesting figure, Lewis, who I've never really managed to crack in my own feelings on his work, and indeed my own sort of attempt to kind of engage with him as a scholar, because I guess my natural impulse when I think about Lewis is to kind of do something to try to complicate the picture of him that tends to exist within the kind of public media, which is so dominated by this story, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, one of many, many, many stories he would write, not only the Narnia stories, but elsewhere. And I wonder what your feelings are on what made you want to kind of tell the story of Lewis and his writings, because I don't know, to me, people think of him as a kind of all too simplistic kind of Christian allegorist, right? As if his number one motivation was to somehow retell biblical stories with talking lions, which I just think does such a disservice not only to kind of the complication that is Lewis the man, but also the complication that is The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, or Narnia more broadly.
Exactly, Alex. I mean, this is, I think, one thing when you look at him, he is primarily a medieval scholar. He is someone who has, his major work at this time was writing what he called, oh, hell, because it took forever. It was the Oxford History of English Literature in the 16th century. And so this is what, and then he had all these twiddly bits, these kind of like Christian apologetics and fantasy novels, science fiction novels. And so he'd play with these other things. And he and Tolkien, we'll talk about them kind of later on too, but they just wanted to write literature for themselves. But he would bring this medieval mindset into his work. And it's more sophisticated than we realize. I mean, Paul Ward, who is a professor out at Oxford right now, found what he called the kappa element in Lewis. And for about 30, 40 years during Lewis studies, people just saw him basically as this kind of Christian polemicist. But he's doing so much more. He's kind of creating this medieval world that refers to kind of the planetary influence and all of his works and everything else. And he's trying to kind of awaken what he called Sehnsucht, this German idea of longing. He felt it in himself. There's something beyond my material existence. And what is that? And so it's this quest that he has for this longing, this desire for something he doesn't know what it is. And it was MacDonald, as we mentioned, that kind of baptized his atheist imagination. The other thing that gets to him, because when he started writing, he started with images. He didn't start with, okay, I'm going to try to evangelize people. Christianity was the farthest thing from his mind when he started The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He started with images of a faun who is not a Christian character. I mean, this kind of little satire, and he's kind of a naughty little character when we'll see him. And he's carrying packages in the winter. And then you have this witch, and a witch is someone that a lot of fundamentalists in the Christian denominations have really kind of had problems with. What's he doing with witches? She was there. And it wasn't later, and then the lion came bounding in, and the lion had nothing to do with Christianity. He'd been reading the novels of Charles Williams, the place of the lion and the kind of archetypes that Charles Williams brought in with his supernatural thrillers that are really scary. I remember reading them in seminary, and I could not go to sleep when I was reading them, and they scared the hell out of me. And so I had to go back to my Bible, but sometimes that didn't even help because Williams had just power with his images, fantastic images there. But Lewis said, no, it started with these images, but then after a while, when you have these images, you follow them, and it's more like bird watching than building a structure. It's more, instead of arguing, it's something that you're just following. And so the stories would come to the author, and then basically the rationalist would come along and then put it into a structure. And so that's when all of a sudden he realized, no, this fits along with the idea of the Lion of Judah, a lot of kind of Hebrew ideas of what a lion is, the biblical ideas that are there. And so he pulled these things together and then began to kind of create this series.
I have a very sort of straightforward. I get to be the Luddite this week, Alex. Which is so. Where do these seven, and I'll say it, Portal Quest fantasies? Where do these seven novels sit in his career? Are they right at the start? Are they like what's his sort of where do they sit in relation to his kind of trajectory?
He didn't become a Christian until his 30s. And Lewis wrote a lot of kind of academic works, The Allegory of Love. He wrote other kind of essays, preface to Milton on Paradise Lost. He wrote about Spencer's Images of Life, a lot of great academic works. And then he and Tolkien said, let's write something that we would enjoy reading. How can we translate our theology, our worldview into the vernacular? Now, both of them eschewed the idea of allegory. Lewis has been called an allegorist because he uses kind of images that seem like, the idea of the resurrection, the death and resurrection of Christ is in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, but that wasn't his intention. He wasn't trying to do allegory, and there's not a one-to-one correspondence. He was doing what he called a supposal. Suppose there was something like this story in another world. And so he does it with the planet Venus and Pelandra as well. So he'd written his science fiction, he'd written his screwtape letters, he got on the cover of Time magazine, and it's not until the mid-50s when all of a sudden these stories that he had thought about since he was a youth begin to come into formation. And he begins to kind of put them to paper and follow the story where they went.
Let's talk about tone then, because that's going to be key, isn't it? When we talk about how these two adaptations get Lewis or don't, we can talk about the plot differences that they'll definitely make, and we can do all that stuff. But really what we're trying to do is kind of, where's the tone? Is the tone the same? Have they captured the kind of essence? And I think Lewis has such a eclectic tone, not just within Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but sort of within the whole series. We let's perhaps part the whole series for now, just to kind of help keep the discussion slightly more focused. But even within Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, people who are familiar with the story, which is a lot of people, at least within the English-speaking world, will recognise that it can flip from funny fawn by a lamppost saying "spare to I'm about to kidnap you to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver to Fenris Ulf and the kind of captain of the secret police. And I'd like to know about that tone a bit, and I'd also like to know kind of what makes Lewis what's Lewis's brand of fantasy, and how could we articulate
this is a wonderful question, Alex. Just really good. This is where Lewis is much more diverse and really far-reaching than I could imagine. But I think if you look at each of the books has a different tone, but overall, overarching is this kind of Christian worldview, almost a medieval worldview, where everything comes together with this kind of overarching story. And so it's a different kind of fantasy that we've seen in a lot of other kind of modern fantasies. But it's one that's unique for each book, but overarching, it's very kind of biblical in its view.
And it seems to have been. So I'm looking at the multiple kind of adaptations of this. Well, I was going to say these 7 novels, but my sense is that not all of them. I don't know whether all of them have been adapted. It's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is like the sort of the text.
Beyond that, what to do with it? I know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think Terry's articulated the problem that producers face, which is that you that's not how franchises don't get structured around the 7 planets of the medieval solar system very often. They don't like to be tonally inconsistent and be, so. Yeah, exactly. They usually get as far as, I think the BBC version got as far as the Silver Chair, and then kind of petered out. But I'm still waiting for a Magician's Nephew adaptation. That's the one that
my favorite.
But anyway,
and with Greta Gerwig coming out now with her kind of Netflix series, I mean, it's going to be very interesting. Yeah. And I think she's going to do one of the best versions of it, as we'll see. One other thing, if I might mention beforehand, is just Lewis's relationship to film and cinema itself, and the fantastic film. Andre Bazin, who was a great French film critic, talked about film basically as being an art of embalming. It embalms time. It freezes time. He called it the mummification. Lewis also said there is death in the camera, but he meant death in a totally different way. Not just the death of time, embalming of time, but the death of the imagination. When we read something, we're able to kind of picture what this fawn looks like, what Lucy looks like. Once we've seen it on film, we get stuck. It has killed the imagination, and it doesn't work as effectively as it could. But he went to some early movies at the Ritz Theater there in Oxford. And so basically he saw it as something that it doesn't give you an idea as much as it gives you a feeling. And it really can manipulate you. And he saw film doing that. And to me, it was really interesting because here's where we connect Lewis and animation before we get to his films. And he said there was kind of this strange blend of genius and vulgarity in what Disney had done. And some things he saw as unoriginal, which could be good. For example, the drawing of the queen, he says, that's what the archetype of all beautiful, cruel queens should look like. The thing you expect to see. But it's almost so true. I mean, she's just so beautiful, but so cold and hard. But he said, there's really bad originality in the image of the dwarfs. He says, they're vulgar, they're bloated, they're drunken. I mean, it's low comedy. But the one thing he really liked was when, in this kind of Markan style, this fairy tale style, he said, we see these eyes in the dark and we think they're monsters, but they turn out to be basically these gentle creatures, delicate creatures. And he said that was brilliant because Disney was able to put together these two things, this kind of poignancy of the animals, talking animals, but then the terrifying bits together. And he really liked that about Snow White and said it was just wonderful.
Hi everyone, it's Alex here, just interrupting the podcast for a moment. Apologies, we'll get back to the scintillating conversation in just a second. I'm interrupting it with just a little bit of admin and a little bit of a plea to listeners, because we need your help, frankly. We have been running the podcast now for quite a few years. We're very happy running the podcast. We are thrilled by the amount of listeners we get. Always have been, always will be, and it's always growing, and it's always a really wonderful community out there. So thank you so much for listening. But the podcast doesn't do itself on its own. It requires Chris and I's time, and it also requires a bit of cash injected into it. I'm not asking for donations in this little plug here, but I am asking for your help to make sure we keep the podcast going on a financially sustainable and sort of time sustainable place. For example, right, there are hosting fees to pay. Okay, that's a couple of £100 each year. There's things like tech and cables. You might have heard a few episodes where Chris and I sound a bit echoey. That's because one of our cables broke and we had to find a way of replacing it and paying for it. And frankly, one of the things we're trying not to do is use our own money or our own pocket, our own wages, frankly, as full-time academics to pay for this stuff. We'd rather try and find alternative ways of funding it. Now, we have done that in the past and we'll continue to do that. We have no plans to introduce membership fees. We have no plans to start trying to sell you guys merch or asking you to go onto Patreon pages or anything like that. We want to keep this a free, easily accessible, educational resource which we're proud to produce and we're really pleased that we are producing. So all we need from you is just a little bit of more help in terms of helping us to showcase the value of this podcast to some of the people that might pay for it. Okay, so the way you can do this is like a couple of different ways. One, subscribe. Okay, if you're not already subscribed to the podcast on whatever platform you're downloading this from, please subscribe now. Those figures really help us. Second, review the podcast on any kind of platform, okay? A star review is helpful. Written reviews are even better. Okay, if you haven't done one of them and you listen to our show and you think it's valuable, please take 3 seconds out of your day. Just write a couple of sentences about what the podcast does for you, why you like it, and share that on the platform. That really, really helps. Third, share it with your friends. Share it on social media when you see a new episode being launched. Okay, it helps increase the visibility. Hopefully, more people can get it and access it too. That's really, really helpful. Finally. And this is a good one, this would actually be really, really helpful, is email us if you use the podcast in any kind of setting, okay? Whether you're an individual that just finds it useful, tell us why it's useful, particularly on an educational level. What have you learned from the podcast? What do you find that's valuable? What value has it brought to your life? Or what impact has it made on your life? I know that kind of sounds very lofty, but if you can just put the kind of simple, real-world changes that you've made, some things that how's it helped you approach the study of fantasy animation differently, anything like that, you can email us. That would let us know. If you're an educator and you use this podcast either to teach students or as part of your own research or as a way of inspiring further thought, let us know exactly how, some of the specifics. Maybe there's a course you have it subscribed to. Let us know. We know of some of you out there. We've worked with you in the past, but if you whether we've worked with you or not, please drop us that email. Really, really helpful. And you can do that at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. Basically, we can fund this podcast through various ways through our own network, but what we need from you is evidence that the podcast is doing something out there in the world. It could be doing something small and sort of not very tangible, like helping you to enjoy fantasy and animation movies. Great, tell us how. That's really, really useful, but we need the evidence for it. Or it could be, helping teachers, helping practitioners. Are you a company out there that set it on your training session? Anything like that. We know of you people out there. We find you in various different ways, but it'd be really helpful if you could come to us so that we can gather that data as we approach another round of kind of scrape together some cash to keep the lights on. Okay, it's not much. Yeah, it only costs us I don't know, 400 or 500 quid a year to keep this thing going. We think we give a lot of time to the podcast. Hopefully you'll think that's a reasonable exchange. We give that time often outside our full-time jobs. We're just looking to kind of find ways of boosting our case to get the funding out there elsewhere. So no Patreons, no merch, I'm afraid. But if you could help us in those ways, share, subscribe, review, or email us with your stories, that would be very helpful. The email address again is fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. Let's get back to the show.
I was going to say, it's really interesting. I hadn't realised that kind of connection, that kind of placing of Lewis within these ideas around animation and kind of cinema more broad in the case of Bazan. But I was thinking, just to go back to that idea of kind of supposal, I was thinking about some of the stuff that we've talked about on the podcast before about animation is this kind of fundamentally, rhetorical and enunciative. It's often been read, animated films have allegories, but the medium of animation is fundamentally kind of metaphorical or allegorical because it can only ever be a comment on the thing. It's not the thing itself. It kind of commits to the idea of what things look like because, as I've said many times, the page will be blank. But it's interesting, this sort of kind of supposal. I was wondering whether animation, therefore, is... it's interesting that of the adaptations, I think the first one isn't animation in 1967, but by 1967. Yeah, there's a first television adaptation in 1967, and then the animated version that we'll look at from 1979. But it's interesting. I'm sort of floating now with this idea of animation is this kind of medium of supposal. It's sort of it's a bit of a flippant comparison, but there's something quite interesting around. Okay, well, all animation is symbolic because it's the symbol of the thing, not the thing itself, because it's not photography. But the idea, if as you said, that Lewis is saying that Aslan isn't an allegory for Christ, but God just manifested himself in another world. It's just I was struck by that kind of potential. It makes perfect sense. Animation is a really one of the earliest adaptations of this story because animation itself is a kind of medium of supposal because it's a comment on the thing rather than the thing itself.
I think
anyway.
Lewis would have been a great fan of fantasy animation.
That's a sound bite. That's a sound bite.
He recognizes not only the power of kind of fairy tales and fantasy, but I think even in these kind of reactions to these two animated films by Disney, and he had not yet experienced Pixar, or other kind of international films by Miyazaki or others. I think he would have been much more open.
Well, on that note, let's get to these movies. So I propose perhaps we'll go through the kind of beats of the story and see how they compare across the adaptations. But maybe before we start, we should just give a little 2 cents on what each one is, and perhaps some brief thoughts on or knowledge of the production context behind either of them. The BBC one I'm a bit more familiar with, but Terry, perhaps you could start us off. So we got this 1978, 1979, the release in 1979, made largely in 1978, I believe, but correct me if I'm wrong. Fully animated, hour and a half, television special. Tell us the rest of the story.
Oh, it's animated by Bill Melendez. Bill Melendez is one of the sweetest animators. I mean, he started at Disney, and then during the strike, he went to Warner Brothers and then UPA doing commercials and everything else. And then he connected with Charles M. Schulz, and Schulz with the Peanuts, and as he did the kind of the Woodstock and the Snoopy voices. But these films were two-dimensional, and they really fit the comic strip format because the characters talk a lot and they don't move. There's not a lot of action. And so he came over to his London studio, and he did the Gilbert and Sullivan, Dick Deadeye. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's Dick Deadeye.
No, okay.
Chris, have you seen it?
No.
It's wild, but I think it's his best, Bill Melendez's best work. But he then got the opportunity to do this other, and he got a Peabody and an Emmy, and he called his Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe the best children's film ever made, better than Pinocchio. I mean, he's really off on this, really off. It's one of the flattest things, and I think Lewis is rolling over in his grave in Oxford over this. He had to work with the Radio TV Foundation of the Episcopal Church down in Atlanta, Georgia. And first he said they're very strange people. And he said, really, they're not nice people. These are not nice people, these church people who are they were fundamentalists there. In fact, the head of there's a thing called Movie Guide. And Ted Baer, who was head of Movie Guide, was there and part of the Episcopal Church at the time. And they kind of hold on. They have kind of a fundamentalist approach to looking at films of, let's count how many blasphemies, how many breasts are in a film, how many things of violence. And so it's really kind of a quantitative fundamentalism that really doesn't capture anything. So he had to work under that. But Bill Melendez came and he tried to do something good. And he caught some of the spirit of it, but it opens almost like a 1969 Monty Python cloud image. With these kind of clouds parting that are there, or the wallpaper in Toy Story. I mean, that's the first image you get there. And there's a lot of panning and tilting. And so it becomes very prosaic, just not kind of capturing the emotion, the passion, the enchantment of really what Lewis had done. In fact, when we meet Mr. Tumnus, he looks like a faun out of Bruno Bozzetto's Allegro non Troppo. I mean, he's got kind of green hair and a red face, and he looks really creepy, and inviting this little girl into his cave. I mean, you can see where Philip Pullman gets kind of his kind of antipathy to Lewis, because you make this almost a pedophile, this faun, and satyrs and fauns were not known for being modest in many ways. And then they give a close-up of Mr. Tumnus's library, and here's the place where Tolkien just went ballistic over the whole story. Because Lewis, I just taught a 7-week course on Narnia for grown-ups, and went into some of these naughty bits that Lewis kind of plants all over in Narnia. And one of them, he talks about the library in Mr. Tumnus's cave. And he's got books like, Is Man a Myth? Okay, that's, our faun's a myth. But then he goes on, The Lives and Loves of Silenus, who is the fat, drunken kind of Bacchus character, who follows Dionysus around. And then he adds nymphs and their ways. And here's a bachelor writing about nymphs. And Tolkien says, does Lewis know what he's talking about? He's talking about women and their ways. Lewis doesn't know any of this. And it's really kind of very funny. But he's throwing in, again, something that fit in with this kind of jovial, kind of Jupiter myth, with all of these kind of fauns and satyrs and centaurs and all these kind of classic characters, and he mixes in all these mythologies. And as you mentioned, Fenris Earth, the Norse mythology comes in, because he wants to show in this, and Father Christmas comes in, that Tolkien couldn't stand. How is he putting all these together? But they all under the sign of Jupiter. And when you're beginning to study these kind of cosmological science, and you see how all these characters fit, you realize he has created this coherent world that is just amazing. But you have to kind of go deeper into what Lewis was doing. And of course, Melendez doesn't do that. He also cuts out some key things. In fact, the death of the character of Aslan there is almost like a Ralph Bakshi, very murky, Lord of the Rings. It's really just bad animation. It's just so bad that goes on. But the one thing I do like in all of this is that Lewis, in writing the Chronicles of Narnia, when you have the death of Aslan, you have all these frightening creatures there, and he warns adults. He says, don't let adults know what these things are, or they wouldn't let you read it. And to give you an example of the kind of creatures he puts in there, he talks about ghouls or specters, which are these kind of terrifying phantoms. He talks about bogles or ogres, frightful goblins and hideous flesh-eating giants, minotaurs, the bull-headed men, hags, ugly witches, the cruels, the people of the toadstool, an incubus, this demon who sucks the lifestyle out of women in their sleep, Ifrits, kind of the evil demons from Muslim mythology, wraiths, orkneys, which are orcs. All of these creatures says, but don't let adults know that you're reading about these, or they wouldn't let you read this book. And so Lewis plays with kind of all these kind of frightening creatures that he puts in there. But we get those kind of creatures at the death of Aslan in the Melendez movie, but the whole thing leaves you, I think, very, very flat.
No, it's funny you mention, Bakshi. I mean, I've got a lot of notes, and actually, I was thinking maybe I'm preempting Alex, but I've got a cross between, with regards to Mr. Tumnus, I've got basically a cross between the Child Catcher and something out of Ralph Bakshi. And it felt very sort of, I know, Alex, you've written on Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, but it felt sort of from that wheelhouse, not just the kind of colour palette. Again, we've talked in previous episodes about particular kind of, I guess, from the 50s and 60s onwards, that sort of compositional looseness that a lot of kind of animation has. I was interested to find one of the Humberston, so Arthur Humberston, that Arthur Humberston was an animator who worked on Watership Down, Yellow Submarine. He's also in the credits of this. So there was just some nice little connections that I was making to different kinds. Being not familiar with the adaptation, one thing that kind of struck me, I guess, as a process of adaptation, and having already seen the 2005 version when it originally came out in the cinema, how the animated version takes us right into the story. So Lucy returning after being there for a few hours. And so I thought that was really interesting. I also thought that the children felt, maybe this is a false assumption, but the children felt slightly older in this adaptation. I don't know. There's something. Yeah, I've just wrote children slightly older in this adaptations, and then we flash back to Lucy when she first stepped inside. One thing that also struck me with regards to voices. Now, I must confess, I flicked between the British version or the UK version and the American version, because both were available, and I was really interested in kind of the comparisons between the two voice casts. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Mr. Tumnus and the White Witch in both adaptations are British, which I thought was a really interesting decision to maintain them as British in the American version. That's what I thought. We could make
quite right.
We could make a link to basically any Hollywood movie where Alan Rickman's the villain, but there's something kind of interesting. I don't know.
We're evil and we're historic, and both, and that helps both of those characters.
I thought that was really interesting. But I did have a question mark around Mr. Tumnus, which was I had villainous, the way that he's sort of framed, and that kind of connection that you hinted at it, that sort of connection to. I just wrote Mr. Tumnus has fantasy literature, because I was just really interested. I couldn't really quite see what was, and you mentioned a couple of the titles that are on his shelf, but there's a construction of his kind of character, and then he dematerializes into flames. Like there's some stuff going on there.
Yeah, there really is. I mean, very scary. And I think your connection with Ralph Bakshi, that just struck me as well. There's something kind of very murky and evil in him. The other thing about them growing up too, I really noticed that's something that Susan, because she's left out of the last Narnia book, because she grows up. And essentially, she puts on lipstick and makeup, and these are the things that the GIs brought over in the 40s, that chocolate, lipstick, and nylons they would give to British girls and kind of seduce them, as it were. And so Lewis is attacking that. So at the end of this kind of animated version by Melendez, you see them, the four of them sitting as the kings and queens of Narnia on their thrones, and the two girls have lipstick and eyeshadow on. And I thought, what is this? I mean, Lewis would just hate this of what had gone on. They matured a little too much for what Lewis wanted to do.
I'm not quite as down on this adaptation as perhaps, but I guess where I'm coming at it is that I think on the one hand, was Lewis alive when this had come out? I suspect he died by then, but I can't.
No, he died. He died the same day as John F. Kennedy and all.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay.
All three of them died the same day.
This feels like the adaptation he would fear, right? In the sense that,
yes,
I think it's partly just a kind of a budgetary concern. It's, the animation is, the frame ratio isn't that detailed. The lip syncing isn't particularly detailed. The design is quite I want to say simplistic, but a kinder word than that. Certainly, it's limited animation. Yeah, it's
very much.
And the effect of that is that you get these kind of quite didactic characterizations of characters that are nice and nuanced, and like Tumnus is the great example, because Tumnus is creepy in the original, but he's not just creepy. He's also charming and funny and befuddled, and he's a very odd tonal character. But you're right, in this he's just creepy. And there's a bit of that.
He's supposed to be there. He's supposed to be there on the liminal side.
Yeah.
I mean, he's already betrayed. He knows he's in the act of seduction and betrayal, but he still has his father who reminds him of what a good fawn could be. And so in this kind of in-between stage, you get both senses really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a bit of that going on throughout. I mean, I was thinking about the character of Edmund, actually. Edmund is, for want of a better word, drawn cruelly in most of this.
Yeah.
When we first see him, he's got kind of snarling, pointed eyebrows. His nose is accentuated. Like, he is drawn as a villain for 2/3 of this cartoon, which and then when he has his kind of, he is forgiven and he has his kind of moment of Damocles kind of conversion, he is drawn softer, which kind of plays into what we're trying to do here. There is a hint in Edmund, the character, and I don't know if it's more explicit in the novel. It's been a while since I've read it, but there's a hint in Edmund, the character, that something has happened to this boy that has kind of cloaked his good soul behind something, and it's happened before the novel starts. I don't know if it's his father going away to war. I don't know. There is something going on that has turned this boy into this kind of, this little rotter that we see sort of throughout the whole story. And Aslan is his kind of experience the white, which is the thing that kind of restores him. It's not that we have a new kinder Edmund in the original. Something is restored in Edmund that the kids, but here it is a kind of conversion, because it's like, well, who's this guy? This nice guy who's now destroying the witch's wand isn't the Edmund we've seen thus far, and it's very easy to completely vilify this character. And I suspect kid audiences would have just thought, why are you even bothering with this guy? Like, there is no sense of a need to forgive this character because of the character design.
I think you're right. I think if you look at the Walden production, they try to give backstory that wasn't in Lewis. But the other thing is, Lewis basically identified with his villains as well. I think when you see Eustace Clarence Scrubb in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader and has a conversion, like Edmund's conversion betrayal, those are Lewis's conversions. Lewis did not want to convert. He was begrudging, he reluctant, but he just saw the truth of what he saw as the gospel message, the truth of it. And so he identifies with Edmund here, and then Eustace later on, as the people that need to be changed.
Yeah. When you say, Alex, rotter, which is a fantastic word and reminds me of when I used to read the Beano, Edmund is a rotter. You mentioned that something's happened. I mean, I've not really noticed the change in character design, and after 5 years or so of doing this podcast, it's just so nice to hear you talk about animated character design.
Thanks. I imagine you get a similar feeling as when you say the words Portal Quest.
But you said that something has kind of happened before the novel starts. But it was interesting that, again, the opening to this animated adaptation seems to omit entirely the wartime context, and we'll get to the television series, which kind of restates it kind of 10 years later.
Well, let's do that now, because you're right. That's a really good comparison, because the British version is very. My first note on the British version is this is very Railway Children, or very like Swallows and Amazons. Like the way the opening of that does is a complete counter, because it completely sets us in this, British big house boarding school evacuees.
Exactly. Marilyn Fox, who did the children's programming for the BBC, she had programmed 2 other Edith Nesbit books, The Five Children in It and The Return of the Samier. So she knew kind of the Sand Fairy and that whole story. So the Railway Children, that's who it is. And we get the sense of the evacuation of the kids. So I think a really great parallel.
Yeah, but then you sort of think, well, and maybe again this is my ignorance of the source material, but again it's interesting that that's the thing. It's not in this version. It's not in the animated version. It's restated for the British television series. It appears again in the 2005 version. But it's just interesting that it's the animated version that doesn't do that. It's not
right.
And I'm not saying that it wouldn't read as well or effectively because it is animated, but it's just interesting that they really, they're leaning into the fantasy right from the start. She comes out of the wardrobe, and this goes back to my sort of tension, I guess, with the film and the way that the way that the episode that isn't out yet, but I guess the broader discussion around what they're learning from this fantasy world, and whether there's enough, whether they spend enough time in the real world to actually kind of meaningfully put those things that they've learned into practice. And so sorry, Alex, go on.
Well, no, but that's exactly why I have a little bit more time for the animated version, and why we're not spending a huge amount of time kind of unpicking the layers of the Christian allegory. And I actually think I don't want to learn anything too much from this world. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not that interested in making sure the kids have learned something. I think you can find things they've learnt. You can do it. Good Lord, lots of scholars, Terry included, but many others have highlighted the kind of messages of the thing. But to me, the raw pleasure of these things, like, it's kind of the imbalance in the structure and the kind of makeup of this story and the things that you can learn from it, right? I've read so many times scholars like to point out that, like, it has a kind of this fairy tale triad structure, doesn't it? They enter the wardrobe 3 times. It's like the 3 little pigs. It's like Goldilocks. But they sort of do. But they enter the first 2 for like 4 seconds, and then the whole film is largely in the last one. Yeah. So like the kind of the effective quality of the tale just feels so much richer than what they could learn from experiencing. To me, not to just get my obligatory Wizard of Oz reference in, it's like deducing the Wizard of Oz to its final line to me. Like it's so much more than that. Yeah.
Now, the other thing I'd say that you really miss in these films anyway, from the book, is that Lewis has all of these avuncular asides, which are so funny. And one of the things that he mentions 5 times in the first 2 chapters are, whenever the children go into the wardrobe, they do not close the doors. Because of his friend, Mrs. Barfield, his friend Barfield, Owen Barfield, his wife, said, no, she told Lewis when she read the first thing, she said, never let a child go into something without keeping the door open. In these, they close the doors. And so it's really going against everything. And Lewis's kind of running joke of don't close the door is really funny. But yet, getting on to the Marilyn Fox one, the BBC, there were a couple things did work for me. One is Sophie Wilcox, the little actress who plays Lucy. And Georgia Henley is the best thing I think about the Walden presentation too. These little girls look so innocent and so wide-eyed, and you could identify with what they are seeing. And it's fantastic. I mean, it's marvelous. And so you're seeing through their eyes. And so I like Forrest. And she has what we Americans say, British teeth. I'm sorry, it's just it's that old stereotype that, but she does is these kind of little before braces teeth. And it's just wonderful that there's a charm to it that is so genuine.
Yeah.
Yeah, she looks like an average sort of 9-year-old, wasn't she? Whilst the animated version, she has like blonde hair and pigtails, if I remember rightly, exactly. And like red ribbons, like this kind of idealized 8-year-old that would be on like a packet of cookies rather than like an 8-year-old, which is sort of how it's played in the British version.
Speaking of British teeth, let's talk about beavers. So I thought it was really interesting. I thought you'd like that. I thought that the BBC series, yes, I similarly noted down that kind of railway children introduction, but I was really interested in my kind of ongoing interest in anthropomorphism and kind of contrasting the sort of Basil the Great Mouse Detective style abode of the beavers in the animated version. And I think there's a pleasure in kind of bringing everything down to sort of beaver scale, if such a scale exists. But I thought there was some really interesting, with regards to the animals, the kind of anthropomorphism of this sort of actors in suits and makeup. I thought there were some really interesting superimpositions where episode 4 with the Father Christmas episode, where you have these sort of people dressed up in kind of practical effects morphing into the real animal, and then the wolves kind of run across the landscape and then morph back again. And I thought there was some really interesting shifts with regards to kind of makeup and effects. And then later in that episode, I just wrote cell animated animals and mythical creatures surround Aslan. So I was so suddenly all this kind of animate. So I was just really interested in that, in the way that. Yeah, the relationship between animation and fantasy that I guess is networked by Lewis together as this sort of interesting figure that connects these two. But yeah, I was just really struck with these kind of impositions and morphs.
Yeah, Lewis was approached early on about doing kind of a media presentation of it. And he said no. He says, I don't want people dressed up in animal suits. I don't want any Christmas pantomime show, Basically, he said, these characters are alive, and all of a sudden they'll become corny, essentially. They'll become too artificial, and you won't believe. And so I think that where animation comes in, and the new kind of the Walden book, you see Aslan. I mean, look at how Aslan flies in the BBC production. This kind of lion going straight up in the air. There's no trajectory or anything. It's just kind of moving across the screen. And Lewis would have hated that. And that's when he denied permission early on for a presentation because he was afraid of kind of really bad animatronics or...
But that's really interesting because again now I've already declared my nostalgia for the BBC series, so I'll declare it then. I'm not really looking at this objectively, but I think if we're talking about what you were those observations Lewis was making about kind of the way viewing can be imaginative and it can conjure kind of personal creative responses in the viewer by reacting to the design. I find far more availability of that kind of reaction in the kind of impositions, the wipes, the dissolves, the furry trousers that Mr. Tumnus is wearing in the BBC adaptation. It's almost kind of Méliès-esque, like it's that fantasy is in between the edits and it's in the stitching together and it's the I know how they did that, but that's cool, like that's kind of creative and fun. I find far more potential to do that with this than say a CGI beaver that sounds like Ray Winston. Like that doesn't offer that level of creativity to me that this does. I mean, very happy that that's just sort of British nostalgia, but I think there is a charm to the to these effects and an imaginative quality.
I would go against Lewis on that too because I find the beavers just two of my favorite characters in Narnia anyway. I mean, they're a domestic couple. I mean, when they're trying to escape, she's trying to collect everything and just delayed, his frustration. And he's proud of his garden. I mean, they're great little characters, and you can have that suspension of disbelief when you see them. Once you get over their first look, then you go, okay, now they're fun characters.
Well, it's in the tradition of the kind of the Cowardly Lion again. It's that's obviously Ray Moore in a lion costume, but hey, let's go for it.
We can get an obligatory Bond reference in. Sorry, at this point, where we're talking about castings. I think one of the characters, I'm going to forget the name, but it does the voice of one of the characters in The Living Daylights. There's just a random actor, just around. But no, on that issue of, I was looking at kind of the history of the the people that did the animation, so TVO London, and the kind of matching of what is cell animated. It was interesting that there was sort of hand drawn animals connected to Aslan versus people dressed as beavers. So I don't know. I don't really have anything interesting to say about other than I thought that those different registers maybe of fantasy were quite what's full animated and what is sort of that pantomimic expression that you described, Terry, as well. That sort of those fluctuating ways of representing. I had my sort of final thing, I guess, from my perspective, is also a question. I am really struck in all of these versions by the inner monologues, the voiceovers that characters seem to, and I think it's in the BBC. Yes, it's in the BBC where Edmund's sitting in the having met the witch, and he sort of realizes that maybe this isn't the best decision that he's ever made. And there's a kind of voiceover. Do you think that she's going to really do and there's this really interesting voiceover that does recur in almost as asides. And so I was just wondering, are these dramatic is this dramatic license, or are these asides? Because I think to have these sorts of children-focused monologues or inner monologues or sort of winks to the kind of camera as the children are realizing and kind of processing the fantasy for themselves. I just thought I was really struck by all of these different monologues that appear in both the animated version and it from 79, and then this 88 adaptation too.
Yeah, I think Lewis borrowed this from Edith Nesbit, this idea to let your characters think. And this is where I think he looked at children and saw really more intelligence going on than most filmmakers do or writers do. He realized there is the inner monologues that they have as well. They're asking these questions.
Yeah.
And so you can identify more with someone who is struggling with something or wondering or feeling jealous or envious. And so he creates that in the books and allows you to kind of go into the interior, go into the inner character, not just looking at them. And he always talked about two kinds of knowledge in something. One is the savoir, where you know about something, and you know about a character, see what they do, their actions. But the other is the connetra. It's this personal knowledge of somehow being able to taste and experience what they're going through. And I think he creates that really well. And I think the films, when they follow that, and this is where the BBC version does a great job, I think, really, of the characters you really believe. These four kids just running into the closet, running around the house, their interactions with each other. There is something that is so enchanting about them, and you believe them at the same time. So you have this believability that is really rare.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's Christmas time. It's the festive time of the year. We're all about to obviously go on our Christmas breaks. So we should just very briefly mention the kind of Father Christmas stuff. I'd like to know a little bit more about what Lewis was doing with that. It always struck me as an not a bad moment, but it is a very Father Christmas is in this story. Every time it comes up in the novel, in any of the adaptations, we actually don't get really a kind of appearance of Father Christmas in. We get discussions, and we get the kind of scene where the Christmas party is interrupted by the White Witch in the 79 version, but we get Father Christmas in the BBC one in his full glory. What are our thoughts on that moment and what it's doing in the original tale and how it's dealt with in or not dealt with in these two adaptations?
This is another one of those moments that Tolkien just went berserk over. And Lewis almost didn't almost publish this. If it hadn't been for a friend, George Sayer, says, no, go and do it. It's going to work. Because he says, what's Father Christmas doing here? I mean, you've got Norse mythology and Fenris Ulf, you've got the Scandinavian Snow Queen, all these other fauns and everything, Greek mythology. What's Father Christmas? And this is where Paul Ward, in his Planet Narnia, said basically Father Christmas is associated with Jove and Jupiter, this jovial thing. And in Lewis's poem on the planets, he wrote a poem called The Planets, and he talks about winter ending, and the celebration at the end of winter is Christmas. And so when it's always winter and never Christmas, all of a sudden you get a hint, you need something that's going to break through that winter. What is going to bring spring? What's going to bring the gifts? But Father Christmas. And so he really ties this in really kind of, you never get it until you read Ward's book. I didn't. I mean, it was just, to me, it was kind of a revelation of really how he showed this, and very convincingly.
It's an interesting moment, isn't it? Because for Narnia geeks, it's actually a really important moment in the wider mythology. Those gifts that the kids are given that's an important thing in the rest of the story.
Yes,
So
it
it's
is.
not like it's a throwaway episodic moment that people can cut out. It has to kind of go in there somewhere. At least if you're adapting the franchise, it does. So it has to be in there. Now I'm going to get very Tolkien on this, and I don't really like to.
It wasn't.
Go on.
It wasn't there in the animated version.
No.
Yeah, but yeah.
Aslan gives the gifts.
Yeah.
I mean, so it didn't. They just cut it out completely. Go ahead.
Which is interesting, because the other thing that I wanted to ask about is that, and I'm getting very Tolkien and demanding inner consistency here, which actually is not my kind of fantasy, really. I'm more in the Lewis side of things. You want to put Father Christmas in it, put it in there. It's fine, but what it does is that, okay, so this is another world, and Aslan is a Jesus in another world. But in this world, there is something called Christmas that the White Witch has banned. But that Christmas is depicted very secularly. It's not depicted as a celebration of Christ. It's Happy Holidays, everybody, which seems very interesting. Thoughts.
But see, the end of Christmas, the purpose of Christmas, is to introduce the incarnation, where Jesus will come and die and be resurrected. It's a preview. I mean, it's setting up the death and the resurrection of Christ. Okay? The other thing Lewis really learned from Tolkien and in their discussions and their debates was essentially all mythologies have an element of truth in them. There is nothing that is completely false. Everything has to be based on some kind of truth. And so they're all shadows of this great myth, which is the Christian myth, which actually happened. So this for Lewis is all these I want to show how all these mythologies come together. They fit. They're not just, okay, we're going to put some in Norway, some in Italy, some in Russia, some in China. All of them are going to come together. And so he is kind of more expansive in that than people realize.
Yeah. I hadn't really thought about that kind of combining of these different mythologies and how they all sort of fit together. You're right, Alex. Santa does have a kind of Father Christmas has this kind of narrative. And I'd forgotten that actually it was in the animated version that Aslan gives the gifts. And I did think about that. And I actually rewound the episode when I watched it, because I thought Aslan gave him the gifts. But no, it is in fact Father Christmas. But it's interesting that you say that there's only there's no sort of chance for celebration. Once Father Christmas has sort of been and gone, there are scenes where you have the other sort of characters, anthropomorphic characters, having a whale of a time, because they're eating, it's the Mad Hatter's tea party. They're all kind of sitting around and drinking and and then the witch arrives and says, "Well, where did you get all this stuff from?" Oh, it was Father Christmas. So there is a sort of celebration, but that's the only opportunity. But I think what it is Santa is this opportunity for frivolity in this very upright and rigid world. But
that's
anyway,
very jovial.
Yes, very jovial.
It's very jovial.
One thing that they haven't really captured in any of the films yet is how Lewis emphasizes food throughout. Food is key to his storytelling, and everyone is always eating at the beaver's house. In fact, what is the great form of temptation in this movie? Food. Turkish delight. And if you look at Coraline, Hansel and Gretel, Alice in Wonderland, I mean, all these children's stories, children are tempted by food. And Lewis believed that if they learn how to deal with the temptation of food, later on in life, when fame, power, sex, riches, all these things come to tempt them, they have already learned to deal with their greatest temptation early on.
Yep.
But when we splurge our children with food and give them whatever they want, they're not going to have any resistance later on.
Yeah.
We should probably talk about the White Witch, how she works in both adaptations, how she's depicted, how she's seen, and perhaps also the moment, given that we are kind of framing this as a Christmas special, and think about the kind of the moment that everyone knows from this story, which is the death and resurrection of Aslan, and how that's depicted in each adaptation. I don't know where to start with this, really. It's such a complicated moment to get right that I can forgive quite a lot of these adaptations when they don't quite do it. But it's got to communicate so much that it's got to communicate Aslan's sadness, his sense of fear. It's got to communicate the horror of this sequence where the White Witch, we see he's slain, and the joy of him coming back, even though we all know it's coming. How did we feel that each adaptation kind of dealt with that kind of sequence?
That's a really kind of delicate moment there. Barbara Kellerman did a good job, I think, really, as the White Witch in BBC.
Yeah, she's good. Yeah.
For Lewis, Queen Jadis, who will appear kind of back in The Magician's Nephew as well. She's basically based on Lilith or Circe, these kind of ancient sorceresses that are there. Right. And so he pulls them together there. In fact, George MacDonald wrote a book called Lilith about this kind of demonic woman. And it's kind of toxic femininity. We talked about toxic patriarchy, but toxic femininity can be as strident as anything too. And so he allows this woman to come out. But coming to this moment, it's like when you've seen Lucas Cranach's paintings of the crucifixion, and you see all these kind of mocking faces that are there, the kind of cruel faces. Lewis really kind of wanted to capture how horrific this was. And so it really stops in the film when you're going through this, and when you're reading the book. But children sometimes can't stand that moment. But it really is very important for Lewis to say, we've got to face that there is death in this world, there's fear in this world. These are the things that happen around us, and how do we deal with them? And so he's trying to kind of present it in kind of a indirect way, kind of this fictional fantasy way, to let them understand that this is going to happen in their lives too, in a way.
I think there's definitely. I mean, I don't have much more to add. I thought it was interesting when I think it's in the animated version where Aslan's resurrected. You have this kind of interesting point of view of him charging towards the castle, which I thought was really striking. But I guess you can look online, and this probably comes from all these sorts of kind of queer readings of the witch and of Narnia and the kind of relationships and the otherness as well that's maybe attributed to Edmund as this character who's kind of can't find his place. You know, there's lots of kind of queer readings of Edmund, but I suppose I get a lot of students that are interested in kind of Disney villainy and kind of queerness with regards to Disney villainy, from Ursula to sort of Scar to Jafar, to even Frollo from Hunchback of Notre Dame, despite the fact he sort of is tempted by this dancer Esmeralda. So I thought some of the animated design, well, actually in both versions, actually Kellerman's performance and the 79 version, there's a sort of one could do some sort of visual or artistic stylistic parallels, I think, between some of the ways in which Disney has drawn villainy and the kind of villainy of the performance. I don't really have anything interesting to say about that, other than there's a kind of a similarity.
I think one thing that Lewis really kind of put himself into many of the characters, I think, in some ways. And when it comes to what he was tempted by or what he saw as sins, I mean, for him, homosexuality and gambling were never temptations. I mean, one of his best friends, Arthur Greaves, was a homosexual, and they had correspondence through 50 years, just really good friends, but it wasn't something that he dealt with. What he dealt with was flippancy. He said, I have this arrogant attitude. And what we miss about the White Witch is her arrogance. It's her ability to kind of put down. I mean, she really is just kind of hot cold in this kind of toxic relationship to Edmund and to everyone else. And so for her, it's this kind of anger and pride that Lewis has in himself. And he's saying, look, here's the villain. I'm the villain.
Yeah. That's really interesting. What you were saying earlier about like him having great sympathy for his villains, it made me start thinking actually Jadis, the White Witch, is a very overtly fearful character. As well as a character to be feared, she is quite obviously fearful. And perhaps the horror of that moment where she slays Aslan is it's the one moment in the film or in the story where she isn't fearful. Like she's so relieved to be rid of fear, because the moment she turns up in the story, she's, oh my god, there's one of them, oh my god, there's four of them, she's very reactive. Like, she's not despite the fact she's been in control of Narnia, that's not what we see. We see the moment she starts to lose control, and she's pretty powerless to against it. And I'm not saying this is designed to court empathy, but she's not a confident character. You don't feel her sense of bravado. She's not a swashbuckling Darth Vader, evil villainess in that respect. Her cruelty is fueled by fear of Aslan, of the prophecy, of her losing control, of her own death, of her sister in her backstory. All this sort of stuff. She is a character that is fueled by fear, and the moment she isn't fearful anymore, is when her full wickedness
I think
is
you've
kind
captured
of
something
on
about Lewis.
screen.
I think if I'm projecting maybe a little bit, but he has a sympathy for sinners because he is one. He knows
Yeah,
it in his own heart. In fact, when
yeah.
they asked him about writing screwtape letters, they asked, "Did you study moral theology?" He said, "No, I just looked at my heart and I realized how wicked and selfish I am." And that's what it gets down to of looking at that. The other thing that the films miss, I
Yeah.
think both
Uh,
films miss quite a bit, is that they are fictional versions of his BBC talks on Mere Christianity. In Mere Christianity, he has several episodes that he uses in kind of an evangelistic way, but now they're indirect. For example, one of the key ones is where he talks about Jesus is either a lunatic, a liar, or he is who he says he is. He's the Son of God. Okay? So that trilemma he puts in Mere Christianity. That trilemma occurs when the professor says, is Lucy lying?
Yeah.
Or is she crazy? Or who do you trust? Okay, so it's the same message, but one in fictional form and one in didactic form. The second one is at the end when he comes and he turns the animals from stone back into life. At the end of Mere Christianity,
Yeah.
his broadcast talks, he talks about how we can live a bios life, which is like lifelike statues, or when the Holy Spirit breathes upon us, we move into this Zoe life, this abundant life. And so they're using that kind of same thing. And Pentecost comes at the end of the book when all of a sudden you have the flame coming up over the animals and it releases them from their stone. You have the breath of Aslan, the breath of the Holy Spirit, and you have them all speaking in tongues. Every animal, the kind of the neighing, the body, the oinking, every kind of animal sound is all of this kind of babble at Pentecost. And so he is kind of putting the whole church history in that nobody recognizes, but it is so kind of clever. And it goes, oh, that makes sense. This is how these things fit together now. But the film will kind of, you'll miss that
Yeah.
because the writers aren't looking for that as well, the adapters.
Interesting. Yeah, I find with the final finale of all of these kind of adaptations, there's a, I don't know, it becomes more simple, it becomes far less interesting, far less nuanced as it gets to the mechanics of, right, she's on that side, they're on this side, we're gonna have a fight now. Like, yeah. I find that there's something odd about that in the Hollywood producers in particular seem to think that all audiences want a big battle, and it's often when the big battle happens that things get the least interesting. And I'm not just it's not an anti-spectacle point. It's just an anti it's just okay, yeah, fine, right, okay, yeah, we're here now.
Lewis has one complaint too about Phil that I forgot to bring up. He says they always have to put in, for example, King Solomon's Mines. He went and saw, and he loved this idea of kind of the claustrophobia. You're in this cave and you can't get out, as opposed to having an earthquake and everything else. But he says, but they put in some young woman wearing shorts who has nothing to do with the plot, but Hollywood has to put that in. And that's what happened in Prince Caspian, why it was such a bomb, is they create this romance between Caspian and Susan, which is nowhere near in Lewis's works. And then they create a kind of a rivalry between Peter and Caspian, and it just makes it so artificial. And I remember when they burst into kind of a Disney song, I just screamed in the theater. I mean, just, no! I yelled out. I said, this is awful. This is just bad. And so they ruined that.
Do we have any final notes on either adaptation before we come towards a conclusion? I sense our time is running short.
No, I had stuff on kind of the limited animation. I'd love to delve a bit more into. This is always, I think, within animation history, this sort of, loosely speaking, the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, until Disney start making films again. It's sort of a really interesting period where not much has been written about these different animated styles that are kind of floating around and perhaps the reasons for them. And I certainly hadn't heard of this. Some of the kind of production personnel behind the scenes. So I think as a really interesting set, the animated version, late 70s, just before whatever the 80s would bring with regards to animation and the resurrection or renaissance of Disney. I think there's certainly something to say about the way that character design, I think, works. Certainly, yeah. So I was really struck. I mean, I hope I haven't been too down on the animated version, but because I thought structurally, there was the interesting stuff around kind of omitting the wartime context gave it a bit of something. But I had notes on limited animation and why are all the villains British. So there we go.
Exactly. And what it also reminded me of were fractured fairy tales. Do you remember kind of the
Oh yeah,
Rocky
yeah,
Bullwinkle,
yeah,
the
yeah.
fractured
Oh,
fairy
yeah.
tales? I mean, but it's very kind of clever. So what they make up in limited animation,
Yeah.
they make
I
up in
was
scripts. But it had that kind of look to it, along with
Yeah, well, I
the
was
Lego
thinking, funnily
non-focal.
enough, this is terrible, but that Scooby Doo was only 10 years before, and there was just a whiff in the animated version of sort of the what is it, the Mystery Incorporated, the gang going off and finding. There was just a kind of whiff of that, but
Lots of sort of landscape shots with them all sort of walking across the frame, in their
So
coats.
and the kind of
Yeah.
make up the different sort of personnel, and maybe I know it's for a blog post rather than anything more than that, but a kind of comparison between. I'd just be interested to know whether the way that there's the characters are designed, there's a sort of Fred and a Daphne and a Velma, and anyway, too much, too far. But there we go. So nothing more from me. I guess. No, go on, Terry.
And just one last kind of reiteration of that. Charles Schultz, I think, just really his style of cartooning really influenced Melendez from his Peanut specials, which were wonderful, to this film. And this film did not really invite that kind of limited animation.
Yeah.
We teased this at the start, so and before we let you go after taking up far too much of your time to chat about different versions of The Lion, the Witch, and
I'm
the
a
Wardrobe.
professor. I've got lots of time.
Well. Even so,
Yeah.
before you go, we'd like to. Yeah, we teased it at the start, but you mentioned that you're starting a new project on Pixar. So obviously you've covered lots and lots of different things throughout your kind of publishing career. Your recent book, obviously, Animating Parables, and now we've got something on Pixar. So what are we doing with computer animation?
Really interesting because you've written on computer animation. You are the expert on this, but we're looking more at content. And
Yeah.
if we took Soren Kierkegaard, the kind of Christian existentialist, to the theater and watched all these Pixar films, what would come out? And so, for example, in Coco, the importance of memory and recollection, looking at the despair of a character, of Carl, and how do you handle that? And how do you get your false illusions? And in the beginning of the film of Up, he and Ellie learn about this idyllic place through the movies, but it is not real. And it only takes you've got to find at the end that the relationship is what is real, not the and so there's just we're trying to say, what would Kierkegaard say about these movies? And I'm working with a Kierkegaard scholar, Stephen Emmanuel, who has just kind of done the 7-volume series. No, there's 7 volumes on Kierkegaard's thoughts. But
Yeah.
so we're seeing what happens if we take him to the movies, and it might be a bomb. It might be just one of the worst, least read things we've ever done. I have worked with my daughter and son-in-law who are middle school teachers, and we just did a book called The Joy of Narnia, teaching middle school children how to laugh again, because our middle school students become cynical and mean, and they lose the joy of laughter. And so we're saying, what can we do to bring laughter back? And we find it in kind of moments in Narnia to kind of teach kids to laugh again.
Well, thank you.
Terrific.
And thank you. Yeah, we should pass on our thanks to you for joining us for, I guess, as thorough as one can be in an hour and a half, but certainly a deep dive into versions of this tale. I mean, I've definitely come away knowing a lot more about not only the original stories, but kind of Lewis himself. I'm fascinated by Lewis's connections to animation. I'd love to probe you further on that and the kind of links between figures like Bazan. I didn't think we'd go down the Lewis and Bazan route today, but here we are. So, Terry, thank you ever so much for spending an hour and a half with us chattering away.
Thank you both. Good. God bless. And keep going.
You can find us at fantasy-animation.org, at Fananim Research on various social media accounts, and you can email us at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com for future suggestions of footnotes, or just to get in touch to tell us how much you're loving the podcast. We're going to take a quick Christmas break after. Oh no, we're not. We're going to, of course, because we haven't yet recorded our second Christmas special,
and it's not August either.
And it's not August, so. Of course, given that it's early December, we will have a few more episodes and then we will take a break for Christmas. But that's been us for this episode, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.